What I want to talk about this afternoon is the idea of inevitable surprises. And I am always amazed at how often we're surprised by the future. I'm astonished by it. And given, the nature of the last 20 years, when I look around this room, most of you can remember most of the last 20 years. It's a fairly young group, but most of you can, you think about the last 20 years with the end of the Soviet Union, the rise of the internet, the takeoff of China, the importance of global warming, 9/11, the Iraq War, just one thing after another over the last 20 years that have continually surprised us. I'm 59 years old. One of my earliest childhood memories was the Soviet H-bomb in 1954. I can remember when it happened. I remember Sputnik, when Billy White came running across the street when I was 10 years old to say that the Soviets had launched a satellite. I remember the fall of Cuba and Castro. I remember the Bay of Pigs. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. Just one thing after another, the oil shock of 1973, the Iranian Revolution of 1978. You can just keep going, one surprise after another. The oil shocks, the collapse in the price of oil, the end of the Soviet Union. And yet we make our plans again and again and again as if the world of tomorrow was going to be just like yesterday. Surprises are inevitable. And I think the degree to which we pretend that the future is just simply a continuity with the present is largely a function of our denial. Very smart people are surprised all the time. So it's not a function of brains, it's not a function of information, it just continually happens. And part of it is that we really don't want to see the big surprises, because almost always big surprises imply some necessity for change. You have to do something different if you see the big surprise coming. And most people don't want to do something different. So there's a kind of myopic reasoning. And people don't spend much time on it. And they're really in denial about it. And in the end, I think this is a real failure of leadership. Let's talk now about some of the big surprises ahead. Part of it, one has to understand in a wider context, the global context. There is something new unfolding here. And all of the surprises I'm going to talk about sit in this wider context. And this wider context in particular has two fundamental dimensions. First has to do with the spread of knowledge around the world, and the second has to do with better governance. What is new is that with the end of the Cold War, suddenly we have an integrated world economy and information can be spread around the world. And with the birth of the internet, information is instantly available everywhere. And this happens at the same time that countries have come to realize that the formula for growth is through better knowledge. Smarter people, new industries, reinventing old industries. It's a knowledge-driven growth model, as opposed to resource-driven. In other words, you look at the countries that have done remarkably well, they're not countries that are particularly resource-rich. China or Singapore is the extreme example, which went from a per capita income of $1,500 in 1965 to over 30,000 last year, equal of US and Switzerland and Sweden and so on. I mean, first world country. And with no resources, no land, no fuel, no energy, no agriculture, not even water. They have to ship in water into Singapore. But you look at China, and you compare, say, China to Saudi Arabia, or Nigeria, or Angola, or other rich countries in terms of resources. All they've got is people. And the huge momentum of China is being driven by knowledge. And now with the availability of the internet, suddenly all knowledge is available to almost all people, everywhere, anywhere, anytime. The second thing is better governance. And by this, I don't mean democracy. I don't even mean necessarily good government. I mean better government. And China today, for example, is governed much better than it was 20 years ago. India is governed much better than it was 20 years ago. And you can see the difference between, say, Africa and India. What's the difference? The difference is governance. A number of huge And really quite monumental changes have developed over the last few years in Europe that I think are really quite significant, but on the other hand with some significant issues. One that is simply astonishing is the birth of the euro, that they were actually able to pull that off. It's not a trivial thing. I mean, the Germans giving up the Deutschmark, one of the strongest currencies in the world in the interests of the unity of Europe, is, you know, I mean, the French giving up the franc is one thing. The Italians giving up the lira, who cares, right? You know, could we do it in the United States? Imagine giving up the dollar for the, say, the North Americano, right? We'll combine the Canadian dollar, the Mexican peso, and put it all together, and we'll call it the North Americano, right? Not going to happen. The U.S. is increasingly religious, increasingly conservative in our values, and Europe is cosmopolitan, globalist, not at all conservative. Over 70% of Americans go to church, only 14% of Europeans go to church. You know. So you see a very different kind of mentality among the Europeans, and you can see it in their orientation to growth. They have chosen lifestyle over growth. It's not a very competitive society. It's not a very aggressive society. They look down on America for our competitive entrepreneurial energies. On the other hand, our unemployment rate is less than 5%. Anybody who wants to get a job can get a job in America. Anybody who wants to get rich in America can get rich if they're willing to work hard and be clever. Europe, not so. You know? On the other hand, the lifestyle's great. They really love it. Long lunches, long vacations, great health care, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, a 11% unemployment rate. And it probably actually quite a bit higher than that because there are many people who are really kind of given up and are on the dole. And very high taxes. So they've made a different set of choices for lifestyle over growth. Now this is great for the current generation, and I love the European lifestyle. I love going out, hanging in the cafes of Paris and so on, and Rome, and it's really quite lovely. But you wonder about the next generation. Is this a sustainable picture for the future? And I think there's a reasonable question as to whether that's true. It is really pleasant now, but as their demography changes, it's going to be a very big issue. We see a number of industries, particularly industries like airlines and cars, that can't keep going the way they are. There's got to be some degree of shakeout, some degree of consolidation, some fundamental set of realignments, change in the rules of the game. Airlines, clearly deregulation and price competition and freedom to operate, on the one hand, they like, but on the other hand, nobody seems to be able to make any money at it. And so the question is, what is the appropriate framework of regulation and competitive structure for the airline industry? How many manufacturers really need to survive in the auto industry? Is it clear that GM and Ford need to both survive? That isn't clear. And clearly, Daimler Chrysler, you know, as you know, how you pronounce the Chrysler and Daimler Chrysler? The Chrysler is silent. And it's true. I mean, so for all intents and purposes, Chrysler's gone as well. Now, the really great growth markets are going to be in China, so it'll be interesting to see who really realigns themselves for those markets. We now live in a world where conflict is increasingly based on faith. In the 20th century, it was ideology. It was fascism and capitalism and communism versus capitalism and markets and so on. And capitalism and markets won, fascism and communism lost. And many people, I will say myself included, expected, we were now moving into the sunny uplands of peace and prosperity, and conflict was behind us. Oops, God entered the scene and said, no, thou shalt have war. Because I'm pissed off at somebody. And if it's Allah, I'm pissed off at the Christians. And if it's Christians, I'm pissed off at everybody. And so, you know, we're prepared to kill each other for our gods. And gods are really nasty because people will die for their gods where they may not die for markets. And I think this is very important. We see the suicide bomber as the ultimate weapon, the person willing to die for their god. In 2000, for the first time in the United States, the retirement age went up. And it's gone up a half a year every year since. And there are two basic reasons for this. People don't want to retire and they can't retire. One of the reasons that they don't want to retire is that they're more vigorous, they're more healthy, they're more able, they see a longer life in front of them. They don't want to be bored and play golf the rest of their life. They want to contribute, they want to earn a living, they want to be part of the world. They don't want to disappear off the stage. They're able to. You know, today we say 60's the new 40, 70's the new 50, soon 90's the new 60. I have an 89-year-old mother-in-law who lives out in Rossmore in Walnut Creek. For her 88th birthday, we gave her a Mini Cooper. She is the coolest little old lady in Rossmore. All the old ladies want to run around with her, okay? Well, but that's now possible. That wouldn't have been true a decade or so ago. There wouldn't have been many 89-year-olds driving Mini Coopers around. They're much more vigorous. She is capable of that. That's a big change. It is virtually certain that we're going to see a major disease outbreak sometime in the next, could be months, let alone years. We've already had one great epidemic spread around the world in recent years, and that's AIDS. And we're really lucky with AIDS. AIDS is hard to get. You have to work at it. Imagine if AIDS were airborne or waterborne, and you could just get it from breathing it from someone else or drinking the water that was in some way infected. It could be a species killer. So we're lucky that, you know, it's either sex or drugs that spreads it. You have to do something special to get the disease. We're quite fortunate. Influenza, not so fortunate. Influenza spreads easily. We already have the example from 1919 of the great influenza epidemic, was something like 100 million people died. And roughly every 35 to 40 years there's been a big epidemic. We're due for one. Only now it could be much worse. And the reason is, of course, we didn't have airplanes in 1919. We can spread the disease very fast. We saw how fast SARS could spread, and we saw what the impact is likely to be. And you can see immediately if, say, avian flu, which is the one we're all worried about right now, rightly, because it's extremely virulent if it hits. Right now, it doesn't get passed between people. It's only from birds to people, but not between people. But if it mutates, and there's a high probability that it will mutate to move from person to person, and with a fatality rate somewhere north of 50 to 70%, this is a really serious issue. It's hard to imagine this, but think about the progress in medicine over the last century. Imagine if you'd gone, say, to the dentist in 1905, what that would have been like. Yeah, I can see, like, yeah, right, the very thought of it, you know, before modern anesthetics, you know, when it was a hand drill, right? Ooh, right. It makes you cringe at the very thought of it, right? And there wasn't much before that. The dentists and barbers were the same, right? Or what surgery was like. Or before there were modern antibiotics, and so on, or the great variety of forms of painkillers that we have today, and the great variety of drugs. But almost everything that we do today is about one of two things. We either cut something out of you and rarely put anything back, or we pour nasty chemicals into your body that often have nasty side effects. It may do what we want, but we may not like the other things that it